Hello, back again to continue reading Island of the Blue Dolphins. Chapter 25. The Aleuts never again came to the Island of the Blue Dolphins. But every summer I watched for them, and early every spring I gathered shellfish, which I dried and stored in the cave where I kept my canoe. 2 winters after they left, I made more weapons, a spear, a bow, and a quiver of arrows. These I also stored in the place beneath the headland, so if the hunters returned I would be ready to go to another part of the island, to move from cave to cave, living in my canoe if necessary. For many summers after the Aleuts had gone, the herd of otters left Coral Cove. The old otter, which had survived the Aleut spears, and by now were aware that summer was a time of danger, would lead the herd away. They went far off to the kelp beds of Tall Rock, where they stayed until the first storms of winter. Often Rontu and I would go out to the rock and live there for several days, catching fish for Wonani and the others I had come to know. One summer the otter did not leave, the summer that Rontu died, and I knew then that none of the otter who remembered the hunters were left. Nor did I think of them often, nor of the white men who had said they would come back, but did not come. Until that summer, I had kept count of all the moons since the time my brother and I were alone upon the island. For each one that came and went, I cut a mark in a pole beside the door of my house. There were many marks, from the roof to the floor. But after that summer, I did not cut them any more. The passing of the moons now had come to mean little, and I only made marks to count the 4 seasons of the year. The last year I did not count those. It was late in the summer when Rontu died. The days since spring, whenever I went to the reef to fish, he would not go with me unless I urged him to. He liked to lie in the sun in front of the house, and I let him. But I did not go so often as in the past. I remember the night that Rontu stood at the fence and barked for me to let him out. Usually he did this when the moon was big, and he came back in the morning. But that night there was no moon, and he did not return. I waited all that day for him until almost dusk, and then I went out to look for him. I saw his tracks, and followed them over the dunes and a hill to the lair where he had once lived. There I found him, lying in the back of the cave, alone. At first I thought that he had been hurt, yet there were no wounds on him. He touched my hand with his tongue, but only once, and then he was quiet and scarcely breathed. Since night had fallen and it was too dark for me to carry Rontu back, I stayed there. I sat beside him through the night and talked to him. At dawn, I took him in my arms and left the cave. He was very light, as if something about him had already gone. The sun was up as I went along the cliff. Gulls were crying in the sky. He raised his ears at the sound, and I put him down, thinking that he wished to bark at them as he always did. He raised his head and followed them with his eyes, but did not make a sound. Rontu, I said, you have always liked to bark at the seagulls. Whole mornings and afternoons you have barked at them, but bark at them now for me. But he did not look at them again. Slowly he walked to where I was standing and fell at my feet. I put my hand on his chest. I could feel his heart beating, but it beat only twice, very slowly, loud and hollow like the waves on the beach, and then no more. Rontu, I cried, oh, Rontu. I buried him on the headland. I dug a hole in the crevice of the rock, digging for 2 days from dawn until the going down of the sun, and put him there with some sand flowers and a stick he liked to chase when I threw it. and covered him with pebbles of many colors that I gathered on the shore. Chapter 26. That winter I did not go to the reef at all. I ate the things I had stored and left the house only to get water at the spring. It was the winter of strong winds and rain, and wild seas that crashed against the cliffs, for I would not have gone out much even if Rontu had been there. During that time I made 4 snares from notched branches. In the summer once, when I was on my way to the place where the sea elephants lived, I had seen a young dog that looked like Rontu. He was running with one of the packs of wild dogs, and though I caught only a glimpse of him, I was sure he was Rontu's son. He was larger than the other dogs, and had heavier fur and yellow eyes, and he ran with a graceful stride like Rontu's. In the spring I planned to catch him with the snares I was making. The wild dogs came to the headland often during the winter, now that Rontu was gone, and when the worst of the storms were over, I set the snares outside the fence and baited them with fish. I caught several of the dogs the first time, but not the one with the yellow eyes, and since I was afraid to handle them, I was forced to let them free. I made more snares and set these again, but while the wild dogs came close, they would not touch the fish. I did catch a little red fox, which bit me when I took her out of the snare, yet she soon got over her wildness and would follow me around in the yard begging for abalone. She was very much of a thief. When I was away from the house, she always found some way to get into the food, no matter how well I tried, no matter how well I hid it, for I had to go back and let her go in the ravine. Often, though, she would come at night and scratch at the fence for food. I could not catch the young dog with the snare, and I was about to give up trying when I thought of the toluwash weed, which we sometimes use to catch fish in the tide pools. It was not really a poison, but if you put it in the water, the fish would turn over on their backs and float. I remembered this weed and dug some where it grew on the far side of the island. I broke it up into small pieces, which I dropped in the spring where the wild dogs drank. I waited all day, and at dusk the pack came down to the spring. They drank their fill of the water, but nothing happened to them, or not much. They frisked around for a while as I watched them from the brush and trotted away. I then remembered yuxchal, which some of the men of our tribe used, and is made from ground up seashells and wild tobacco. I made a big bowl of this, mixing it with water, and put it in the spring. I hid in the brush and waited. The dogs came at dusk. They sniffed the water and backed off and looked at each other, but at last began to drink. Soon afterwards they began to walk around in circles. Suddenly they all lay down and went to sleep. There were 9 of them lying there by the spring. In the dim light it was hard to tell the one I wanted to take home, but finally I found him. He was snoring as if he had just eaten a big meal. I picked him up and hurried along the cliff, being frightened all the way that he would wake up before I reached the headland. I pulled him through the opening under the fence and tied him to it with a thong and left food beside him to eat and some fresh water. Before long he was on his feet, gnawing through the thong. He howled and ran about the yard while I cooked my supper. All night he howled, but at dawn when I went out of the house, he was asleep. While he lay there by the fence sleeping, I thought of different names for him, trying first one and then another, saying them over to myself. At last, because he looked so much like his father, I called him Rontu Aru, which means son of Rontu. In a short time he made friends with me. He was not so large as Rontu, but he had his father's thick coat, and the same yellow eyes. Often, when I watched him chasing gulls on the sand spit or on the reef barking at the otter, I forgot that he was not Ron too. We had many happy times that summer, fishing and going to Tall Rock in our canoe. But more and more now I thought of Tutak and my sister Eulapi. Sometimes I would hear their voices in the wind, and often when I was on the sea, in the waves that lapped softly against the canoe. Pardon me. Let me take a quick sip. Chapter 27. After the fierce storms of winter came many days when the wind did not blow. The air was so heavy that it was hard to breathe, and the sun so hot that the sea was like a sun itself, too bright to look at. The last day of this weather I took the canoe from the cave and paddled around the reef to the sand spit. I did not take Rontu Aru with me, for while he liked the cold, he did not like heat. It was good that he did not come with me. The day was the hottest of all, and the sea shimmered with red light. Over my eyes I wore shields made of wood, with small slits in them to see through. No gulls were flying. The otter lay quiet in the kelp, and the little crabs were deep in their holes. I pulled the canoe up on the beach, which was wet but steaming from the sun. Early every spring I took the canoe to the sand spit and spread fresh pitch in the cracks that needed it. I worked all this morning, stopping from time to time to cool off in the sea. As the sun climbed high, I turned the canoe over and crawled under it and went to sleep in the shade. I had not slept long when I was suddenly awakened by what I thought was thunder. But upon looking out from my shelter, I saw that there were no clouds in the sky. Yet the rumbling sound kept on. It came from a distance, from the south, and as I listened, grew louder. I jumped to my feet. The first thing that caught my gaze was the gleaming stretch of beach on the southern slope of the sand spit. Never in my life on the island had I seen the tide so low. Rocks and small reefs that I did not know were under the sea stood bare in the blinding light. It was like another place. I had gone to sleep and wakened on another island. The air was suddenly tight around me. There was a faint sound as if some giant animal were sucking the air in and in through its teeth. The rumbling came closer out of an empty sky, filling my ears. Then, beyond the gleam of the beach and the bare rocks and reefs, more than a league beyond them, I saw a great white crest moving down upon the island. It seemed to move slowly between the sea and the sky, but it was the sea itself. I tore off the shields I wore over my eyes. In terror, I ran along the sand spit. I ran and stumbled and got up and ran again. The sand shuddered under my feet as the first wave struck. Spray fell around me like rain. It was filled with pieces of kelp and small fish. By following the curve of the sand spit, I could reach the cove and the trail that led to the mesa, but there was no time for this. Water was already rushing around my knees, pulling from every direction. The cliff rose in front of me, and though the rocks were slippery with sea moss, I found a hold for a hand and then a foot. Thus, a step at a time, I dragged myself upward. The crest of the wave passed under me and roared on toward Coral Cove. For a time there was no sound. Then the sea began to seek its old place, running backward in long foaming currents. Before it could do so, another great wave moved out of the south. Perhaps it would be even bigger than the first one. I looked up. The cliff rose straight above me. I could climb no farther. I stood facing the rock, with my feet on a narrow ledge and one hand thrust deep into a crack. Over my shoulder, I could see the wave coming. It did not come fast, for the other wave was still running out. For a while, I thought it would not come at all, because the two suddenly met beyond the sand spit. The first wave was trying to reach the sea, and the second one was struggling toward the shore. Like two giants, they crashed against each other. They rose high in the air, bending first one way and then the other. There was a roar, as if great spears were breaking in battle, and in the red light of the sun, the spray that flew around them looked like blood. Slowly, the second wave forced the first one backward, rolled slowly over it, and then, as a victor drags the vanquished, moved in toward the island. The wave struck the cliff. It sent long tongues streaming around me so that I could neither see nor hear. The tongues of water licked into all the crevices, dragged at my hand and at my bare feet gripping the ledge. They rose high above me along the face of the rock, up, and then spent themselves against the sky and fell back, hissing past me to join the water rushing in toward the cove. Suddenly, all around me was quiet. In the quiet, I could hear my heart pounding and knew that my hand still had its hold on the rock and that I was alive. Night came, and though I was afraid to leave the cliff, I knew that I could never stay there until morning, that I would go to sleep and fall. Neither could I find my way home, so I climbed down from the ledge and crouched at the foot of the cliff. Dawn was windless and hot. The sand spit was strewn with hills of kelp. Dead fish and lobsters and pink crabs lay everywhere, and two small whales were stranded against the rock walls of the cove. Far up the trail that led to the mesa, I found things from the sea. Rantu-Aru was waiting at the fence. When I crawled under it, he jumped upon me and followed me around, never letting me out of his sight. I was glad to be home on the high headland where the waves had not come. I had been gone only from one sun to the next, yet it was like many suns, like the time I had gone away in the canoe. Most of the day I slept, but I had many dreams, and when I awoke, everything around me was strange. The sea made no sounds on the shore. The gulls were quiet. The earth seemed to be holding its breath, as though it were waiting for something terrible to happen. At dusk, I was coming back from the spring with a basket of water on my shoulder, walking along the cliff with Rantu-Aru. Everywhere the ocean was smooth and yellow, and it lay against the island as if it were very tired. The gulls were still quiet, perched on their rocky nests. Slowly, the earth began to move. It moved away from my feet, and for a moment I seemed to be standing in the air. Water tipped out of the basket and trickled over my face. Then the basket fell to the ground. Not knowing what I did, thinking foolishly that another wave was upon me, I began to run. But it was a wave of earth, and it rippled under me along the cliff. As I ran, another wave overtook me. Looking back, I saw many of them coming out of the south like waves in the sea. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the ground, and Rantu-Aru was beside me, and we were both trying to get to our feet. Then we were running again toward the headland, toward a house that kept moving in the distance. The opening under the fence had caved in, and I had to pull the rocks away before we could crawl through. Night came, but the earth still rose and fell like a great animal breathing. I could hear rocks tumbling from the cliff and falling down into the sea. All night, as we lay there in the house, the earth trembled and rocks fell, yet not the big one on the headland. which would have fallen if those who make the world shake had really been angry with us. In the morning the earth was quiet once more, and a fresh wind that smelled of kelp blew out of the northern sea.